Welcome, everyone. I'm Cheryl Fishbein, Chair of JCPA, and we are delighted to sponsor this briefing with the JCRC of Greater Washington, which always uses its connections in the nation's capital to help bring to the Jewish community relations network and its top thinkers and its policymakers the most up-to-date briefings of what's happening in the Jewish world. Many of you might have been caught by surprise as the presidential announcement yesterday came out that the U.S. plans to recognize Israel's sovereignty over the Golan Heights. What does this mean, and what are the implications, and how should we as the American Jewish community respond? For this, we have perhaps the leading light of Middle East peace and politics, Ambassador Dennis Ross. David Bernstein, JCPA president, will be interviewing Ambassador Ross, and then we will take your questions. Ambassador, you need no introduction, but here goes with a shortened version. Everybody pay attention, this is the short one. Ambassador Dennis Ross is counselor and William Davis Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. Prior returning to the Institute in 2011, he served 2 years as a special assistant to President Obama and National Security Council Senior Director for the Central Region, and a year as special advisor to Secretary of State Hillary Rodham Clinton. For more than 12 years, Ambassador Ross played a leading role in shaping U.S. involvement in the Middle East peace process and dealing directly with the parties in negotiations. A highly skilled diplomat, Ambassador Ross was U.S. point man on the peace process in both the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton administrations. He was instrumental in assisting Israelis and Palestinians to reach the 1995 interim agreement. He also successfully brokered the 1997 Hebron Accord, facilitated the 1994 Israel-Jordan Peace Treaty, and intensively worked to bring Israel and Syria together. I'd like to say in advance, Shabbat Shalom to everyone, and David, please take it away.
Thank you, Cheryl. Thank you, Ambassador Ross, for being with us. We really appreciate it. Obviously, some of us were caught by surprise, maybe not everyone. Can you tell us how this came about?
Well, I'd love to be able to tell you how it came about, but I think when President Trump tweets, there's not often a lot of, I'll put it this way, a lot of consideration in advance. It seems pretty clear if you read the transcript of his Secretary of State meeting with the traveling press after the tweet was made, when he wouldn't make any comment on it until he had a full understanding of the answer. It suggests that he was not alerted to it beforehand. So I think we've seen this is kind of a pattern with this administration and with the president, that oftentimes he tweets. I'm guessing that one of the reasons that he did it was because Lindsey Graham had been out there, gone to the Golan Heights with Prime Minister Netanyahu, talked about the importance of this. Prime Minister Netanyahu has been pushing for it. And I would guess that's probably the backdrop to it. Beyond that, I don't think I could say. This is, I think, another example of a tweet that catches everybody by surprise. When the president tweeted about withdrawing from Syria, it caught everybody's surprise and led to the resignation of his Secretary of Defense. So I think this is really part of a pattern.
Mm-hmm. So what is the rationale behind this announcement? What are supporters both in Israel and the U.S. saying about it that might have led to this decision point?
Yeah. Look, I think there is a rationale for it. I'll describe it, and I'll explain why I don't fully share it. I think the rationale is that you've looked at war in Syria for basically the last 8 years, a horrendous war, 500,000 people dead, 5 million refugees, 6 million people displaced in the country, Iran now embedding itself in Syria in a serious way, Shia militias, the Hezbollah embedding themselves, The Hezbollah, recently the IDF uncovered that Hezbollah was trying in a covert way to insinuate itself in groups close to the Golan Heights. There is an understandable argument that given everything that's going on in Syria and the strategic importance, the physical strategic importance of the Golan Heights, which is unmistakable and undeniable, that Israel, this needs to be Israel's territory. So that, I think, is the rationale. And it's also send a message Israel's never getting off of it. That's the rationale. The problem is less with the rationale and more with the substance of what's been done. And what I mean by that is this is largely a symbolic move, not a substantive move. Substantively, Israel controls the Golan Heights. And I'll tell you something that won't come as any huge surprise. There is no Arab leader today except Bashar al-Assad who thinks the Israelis should get off the Golan Heights. Every Sunni Arab leader realizes what the Iranians, the Shia militias, represent in Syria, and they see the Israelis are the ones who are actively countering it. No one else is, not the U.S. The Israelis are. So there is no Arab leader that would say, you know, they want to see the Israelis give up control of the Golan Heights. On the other hand, there's no Arab leader who's actually going to publicly say that. Privately, they're not going to say it, and publicly, they can't say it because this is still, in Arab eyes, all right, this is Arab territory. And the problem with what has been done is it takes a situation where Arabs have absolutely no problem with Israel's control of the Golan Heights and forces them to adopt a position where they're against it. Because by recognizing the sovereignty, you're taking Arab land by fiat and now saying it's Israeli land. So Arab leaders before their own publics are not going to accept that. Doesn't mean they're gonna make anything but basically sloganistic statements in response. But here's where the fallout is that's negative. Mm-hmm. If the Trump peace plan is serious, the administration with this tweet has just made it much more difficult to have that plan somehow produce a favorable response from the Arabs. What you're trying to do before you present that plan is create a set of conditions that makes it easier for Arab leaders who at this point are the ones who will respond, because the Palestinians are primed to say no. And what the administration hopes is Arab leaders could say, this is a serious basis for negotiations. They won't say more than that. That's the best you can get. But for them to even say that, it has to be a serious basis. It has to provide for statehood, has to provide for a capital in that state and a significant part of Arabic Jerusalem. It needs as well a context that makes it easier for them to say that. This is a context that makes it harder for them to say it because it takes away some of their political space, puts them on the defensive before the Iranians and others who will say, this is why we have to have resistance. So from a practical standpoint, this has not done anything except make it harder for Arabs to be responsive to what the administration wants. It doesn't make that the rest of the world is not going to embrace the American position. The American position sends a signal that we will back this, assuming a subsequent American administration doesn't reverse this posture. In the near term, as I said, it's completely understandable. Given Syria, given what the Iranians are doing it, this is Israeli control should be very clear. If I had been asked for my advice, I would have said, here's what I would do that will give you the benefits, and even some benefits for Prime Minister Netanyahu, which this seems to be designed to do. There's no other explanation for the timing other than to help him in the elections, which, by the way, is not unheard of. American presidents do that. But what he could have said, with Iran embedding itself in Syria, with the Shia militias embedding themselves in Syria, Israel needs to be on the Golan Heights. Full stop. Then you get the message, all right, Israel's on the Golan Heights, it needs to be there, and here's the reason they need to be there. Now, the value of that is, by the way, it doesn't put the Arabs on the spot. They don't have to say anything. It's not giving the territory away. And it's perpetuating what is the reality of Israeli control, which is what actually matters. So I would have much preferred to see that done. And unfortunately, it wasn't.
Right. So now that the president has announced his intention, at least, to declare Israeli sovereignty or to support Israeli sovereignty on the Golan Heights. What does that mean? Is there going to be any further official action? Unlike recognizing Jerusalem, for example, as Israel's capital, we knew what comes next, which was the establishment of an embassy. Here, we don't have an embassy that needs to go on the Golan Heights. So what happens next? What are we about to see?
You know, the only thing you're going to see is a more formal statement. This was a tweet, and the tweet said, "It's time to recognize." In other words, it doesn't actually say we are recognizing. It says it's time to recognize. As a negotiator, I parse words. So I think what the next step will be, and it's actually the only other step because there's nothing practical to be done, as you note. The next step will be the president saying it's American policy. It is the position of the American government that the Golan Heights is Israeli territory, and we recognize their sovereignty there.
Right.
Nothing else.
Right. My understanding is that Israel itself has not officially annexed the Golan Heights. Israel has declared Israeli law over the Golan Heights, which I guess is a you know, at least an official distinction. Are we about to see Israeli action that would formally declare its annexation of the Golan Heights?
In theory, although in December of 1981, Menachem Begin extended Israeli law and administration to the Golan Heights. It was rejected by the rest of the world, including the Reagan administration. The Reagan administration, in response, suspended strategic cooperation and also suspended F-16 aircraft deliveries to Israel in response. So that was a Reagan administration, not exactly an administration that wasn't friendly to Israel. So I'm not sure that Israel can also declare annexation, but the practical terms are not different because annexation means Israeli law and administration. At the time, what the Israelis declared was characterized as Israeli annexation. Whether this means that this will now, Israel will repeat this or make some other formal declaration, perhaps. But in practical terms, nothing has changed.
I'm going to invite our viewers to pose questions in the question box, and we'll review them and do our best to get to them. Okay, so this happens. Maybe it's already happened. The question is, in the future, if things stabilize in Syria, God willing, if Iran ceases to be a hostile power, if the situation improves, is there a scenario which, after Israel has annexed this, the United States has recognized its sovereignty over it, that Israel could say, okay, now we're ready to trade land for peace? Does this make that harder in a future scenario?
Well, I think it creates more of a kind of barrier politically to doing it, but it doesn't exclude it. I mean, look, if Syria sorts itself out in 10 years, which is what we're talking about, if the Iranians are not there, even if the Iranians have a different kind of posture, if Syria becomes a thriving democracy and wants cooperation with Israel, you could envision something down the road. Now, the problem is everything I just established as if, those seem pretty far-fetched today. But, is it excluded? No, because you could have a future Israeli government that could decide if things have changed or not. And this was transformative in terms of what was happening in the region. You could envision it. But this is designed to make it clear that Israel doesn't intend ever to give up the territory. That's what this is designed to do.
All right. So I'm going to take some questions from the viewers. What does this do in terms of the fight with Iran? Negative or positive?
Well, it's not. Look, it doesn't do anything materially different. It will, the Iranians will claim that all the more reason for the resistance doctrine, but it doesn't. That doctrine exists anyway, so it's not like, suddenly this was going to inspire them to take actions they wouldn't anyway. I don't see this as changing materially the reality. I remain worried that Israel and Iran are on a collision course in Syria, because Iran seems to be determined to create in Syria what they have in Lebanon, where they have Hezbollah with a stranglehold over the government and 130,000 rockets, and trying to create guidance systems to improve dramatically the accuracy of those rockets. Israel is just as determined to prevent Syria from establishing the equivalent of Lebanon there. So that puts them on a collision course. Maybe nothing happens in the coming year, but for me, in the next 12 to 24 months, this is an area that contains the greatest danger for a region-wide escalation. Because Israel is not going to tolerate a situation where there's tens of thousands of rockets that can hit it daily from Lebanon and Syria, and Iran can orchestrate that and remain completely untouched. Israel will hit Iran. And how does Iran respond? Because it can't possibly, the rockets that are fired from Lebanon and Syria are vastly greater in number than anything the Iranians can launch at Israel from Iran. My guess is they hit Saudi Arabia in response as a way of showing, they won't take this, and they can affect American interests. So the point is a conflict there based on the fundamentally conflicting positions of Iran wanting to create in Syria what it has in Lebanon, and Israel being just as determined to prevent it. Sooner or later, that runs the risk of exploding out of control unless the Russians do something differently and unless we do something differently. I don't see much evidence that we will. And right now, the Russians seem to be quite content with allowing the Iranians to not necessarily expand outward their presence, but they're allowing them to build a greater presence on Syrian bases, and they're allowing them to build in northwest Syria more of a rocket presence close to where the Russians are, creating a kind of, in theory, a Russian umbrella for their presence.
Right. Well, speaking of the Russians, do we know how the Russians reacted to this, or how they will react to it?
Well, they've come out and criticized it, said they don't recognize it. Maybe they'll take action in the Security Council, but the Trump administration will veto it. So again, I mean, this was a symbolic move more than anything else, and it will be met by symbolic responses.
Right. One viewer asked the question, does this set a precedent for Russia, for example, to establish, sovereignty in Crimea or Georgia, and for the U.S. to say, okay, now we've got to accept their sovereignty as well? Are we worried about this, the larger precedent of this?
Well, I think look, could others take advantage of it? Sure. Does that mean the U.S. will respond to it? No. But could others take advantage of it? Could the Russians say, the Israelis did this, we're doing it? I think that's a possibility. I think the other thing that worries me is that those on the far right side of the Israeli political spectrum, who could well be part of the next government, will say this is a great precedent. Now let's do it in the West Bank. Now, if you do that in the West Bank, you lose the ability to separate from Palestinians. There's no two-state outcome anytime soon. Regardless of the Israeli government, there's no Palestinian capability, willingness to reach an agreement with the Israelis. So there's no two-state outcome anytime soon. But there is a reality that, given the building outside the settlement blocks in the West Bank, that there's going to come a point where already you have 105,000 Israelis who live outside of the settlement blocks. When I say settlement blocks, I mean the area 5 to 8% closest to the Green Line that houses 80% of all the settlers. But there's 105,000 who live outside those blocks. If you keep building there, there'll be a tipping point relatively soon where you can't separate. And then you're going to have one state for two peoples, which confronts Israel with some very hard choices. So if you see a push for annexation now in the West Bank, which I think is likely, given what's been done, that's going to confront Israel with some pretty hard choices.
So you had stated earlier that the elections were likely looming large in this decision, the Israeli elections. Do you believe this will help Bibi? How do you see the elections playing out now? And will this have an effect on the elections in the U.S.? Is there also a sort of political calculus on President Trump's side as well?
I guess in Israel, look, it's hard to believe there won't be a short-term bump for Bibi, and the election is not too far away. I think that this will be, he'll get more of it when he comes here next Monday and Tuesday, because he'll see Trump, have dinner with him, and then have a meeting the next day. He'll speak to AIPAC. I think he'll get a bump out of that. Now, will that carry him over the threshold on April 9th? Anybody who thinks they know the answer to that is kidding themselves. One possibility, and I don't know if this is the precedent or not, but I'll tell you, in 1996, when I was our negotiator, President Clinton went way overboard in terms of trying to help Shimon Peres, and it actually produced a backlash. Will that be the case this time? I don't know. The context was very different then. By the way, Clinton was perceived even more favorably than Trump in Israel. So there is a certain parallelism there. I don't know. I mean, I really don't know the answer. Ultimately, Israelis are likely to decide this based on Israeli issues. And so, this probably comes at a time that is very helpful to the prime minister, because there were stories all this week about his benefiting with a fair amount of money from a company that he has a cousin who has an interest in, that is also somehow related to all the discussions related to the submarines. So like with a lot of these stories, you don't know what's true, what isn't true. You don't know what's going to stick with the Israeli public, what won't stick with the Israeli public. There's clearly a significant segment of the Israeli public that feels that the Mandelblit decision to indict was heavily influenced politically and isn't taken as seriously as part of the country. If you look at Israeli politics, it's not that different from ours. There is a profound polarization. You'll find, it's the people, they're either for Bibi or they're against Bibi, and it's not unlike what you have here, where there's great polarization with regard to President Trump. So it's a lot depends upon how this all breaks down. I would just remind you also that in 2015, Likud got 25% of the vote, but that was 30 mandates out of 120. You look at the polls, and most of the polls show them running around 26 right now. There's one that shows them at 31, but all the other polls are showing them at around 26. So regardless, it's a coalition that has to be put together. And again, everybody who thinks it's all predictable, it's not so all predictable about who signs up to what. It all depends on what the numbers end up being.
Another question from a viewer, changing subjects here. We know that there are Druze who live on the Golan Heights. Is this likely to create violence there?
I am dubious that it's going to create violence. It is true that the Druze who live on the Golan Heights have a different view of Israel than the Druze that live in Israel. The Druze that live in the Golan Heights are much closer to the Syrians than they are to the Israelis. But life isn't going to change. Nothing's going to be different. Today, Israel controls the Golan Heights completely. And saying that they're sovereign there, or recognizing that they're sovereign there, doesn't change anything that the Israelis do. What would change the situation internationally if others would recognize it, would join us and say, you know what, we accept that. But that's not the case. The EU has come out very clearly against, said they won't recognize it. We've had the Arab League has come out the same. The Russians have come out the same. There isn't anybody at this point who's joining the United States.
Another question we got. Does this contradict UN Security Council Resolution 242?
Well, Israeli government since Yitzhak Rabin said that 242 applied to the Golan Heights. The preamble of 242 talks about no acquisition of territory through conquest, through the use of force. Mm-hmm. So from that standpoint, it would contradict that. But we talked earlier about the fact that if circumstances change down the road, this doesn't preclude reaching an agreement still. where there could be a decision on territory. So I think a lot of this is, I mean, in terms of the international law dimension of it, the more serious possibility may be that it creates a justification for others to do something similar. If it's brought to the Security Council, which it might be by somebody, the Trump administration will simply veto the resolution. So I don't see it really changing anything in that respect.
Great. Any other questions? We're still taking questions, folks. We have some time. Really appreciate your questions. Give it a second here. Right. Are we likely to see sort of a response from the Arab League, from Arab countries in the next few days? Is this likely to cause violence anywhere in the Arab world? I know that was a concern leading up to the U.S. Embassy change.
Yeah, I have to say, at the time, I didn't agree it would produce that after the embassy change, and I don't believe it'll produce it on this either. You know, the truth is, this is not a priority issue for Arab leaders in Arab states. They're focused on other issues. They're not focused on this. The issue is not the violence. The issue is the Arab League has already issued a statement, criticizing the decision. The GCC issued a statement criticizing the decision. I think, you're getting what are statements that are largely pro forma, but as I said before, the irony is no one was talking about the Golan Heights. No one was saying anything about Israel getting off the Golan Heights. And at a time when Israeli control of the Golan Heights is a given and no one was raising questions or challenging it, now you're again reminding people that, but this, that they should be challenging it. Now, there's a difference between challenging it and violence. I don't see this being the result of violence. I am worried that there will be violence on March 30th, which is the one-year anniversary of the March of Return that Hamas began a year ago on the Gaza, to the Gaza fence. I'm worried about it for two reasons. One, it's an anniversary and they'll try to prove something. But two, they've been facing very tough, actually remarkable demonstrations in Gaza against Hamas. Placards saying, "We want to live," reflecting that where they put their money is into their tunnels and their weapons, but not into meeting the needs of the people. I could see them wanting to divert attention away and even wanting to provoke something with Israel as a way of shifting the attention back on the Israelis as off of them. So that's where I'm worried about violence, the potential for an escalation there. But I don't see this triggering it.
Right, and this comes from our co-sponsor, Ron Halber, Executive Director of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Washington. Can you envision a symbolic Syrian military attack on the Golan Heights in response?
No. You have Assad still has his hands full. The last thing Assad needs is for him to do something against the Israelis that then triggers a serious attack that weakens the forces he has. And he doesn't know. I mean, he may count on the Russians providing a kind of defense umbrella, but he doesn't know that. And by the way, if he attacks the Israelis, the Russians won't necessarily be defending him. So I don't envision that. I think that you'll hear, there'll be tough words. He'll claim they're committed. They're more committed than ever to recapturing or regaining the Golan Heights. But I don't see any military action, and if there is, he'll be the loser for it.
Okay. Last time I saw you, it happened to be in a Friday night synagogue. You had just gotten back from Saudi Arabia, and you had reflected a little bit on that trip and what it meant. Obviously, we've seen Israel make some serious inroads in its relations with Arab countries. That's part of the larger context here. Can you tell us a little bit, how optimistic are you that Israel is going to continue achieving successes with the Arab world? Where do you see that now? And how likely is that going to bring peace with the Palestinians in the long term?
Look, I think that there's a reality. I call it a new normal, not normalization. What I mean by the new normal is that the Arab leaders no longer trust the United States. This began to be there for them in a security sense. It began under Obama, but it's continued under Trump. Every time Trump talks about we've spent $7 trillion in the area, he tweets about withdrawal from Syria. Now he tweets here. Each time they're caught by surprise, it makes them feel we want to get out of the region, not stay in the region. They don't feel they can count on the U.S. And they look around and say, who can they count on? And the truth is, there isn't. The Russians are the problem, not the solution. The Chinese are all about one belt, one road and economics. The Europeans, they don't read that way. And they look at Israel and say, look, Israel actually does. It doesn't just talk. Israel is a bulwark against the Iranians and against the offshoots of Al-Qaeda and ISIS. So it creates a practical level of cooperation below the radar screen. Israeli actions can, especially if there's no change on the Palestinians, the cooperation that is very practical, very real, and isn't going to go away because it responds to a real need, will still stay below the radar screen. It will not, it will not be, it will not be something that they elevate in a public way anytime soon. This kind of step, by the way, puts them on the defensive. So it makes them less likely to want to be elevating it, but it won't change the reality because what they do with the Israelis addresses their priority needs and threats. Over time, this can provide more of a basis for changing the landscape fundamentally. One reason I say it's a new normal is because this reflects a new reality. It's not normalization because they won't defend it in public. They won't describe it in public. Until they're prepared to talk about it in public, there's no normalization. So the Palestinian issue will still be basically an impediment to that. And I would say decisions like this won't alter it, but they'll also make them more careful, a little bit more cautious, and they'll go more slowly. So it's not, the new normal is going to remain because the threats are real. And Israel represents basically a source of protection against those threats. And it does offer promise over time, thinking smartly about how you could take advantage of it. You can do something with the Palestinians, but only by bringing the Arabs in, not in a way. The Arabs are never going to publicly say the Palestinians should accept what the U.S. presents, whether it's this administration or another. They will not do that. They'll never put themselves in a position where it looks like they're trying to dictate to the Palestinians. What they can do is say, here's a serious basis for discussion. That they can do. I said earlier what it would take to produce that. My concern, ironically, for the administration is, I seem to be more concerned about this than the administration, that this has made the prospect of their own plan, it's the prospects for its success, it's made it more difficult, not less difficult.
To what degree do you think the changes in the new normal have trickled down to the Arab public? Do we see any evidence at all that the people living in various Arab countries whose governments have become more engaged with Israel are starting to see this and view Iran as a greater threat than Israel and are starting to warm up to Israel?
I wouldn't exaggerate it, but there is a change. There's polling that shows about 25%. There are exceptions to this in Lebanon and Kuwait, but generally throughout Arab countries, about 25% are saying we should cooperate with the Israelis even if there isn't peace with the Palestinians. Now, 25% is still obviously a small minority, but you wouldn't have seen, it would have been zero a couple years ago. So that tells you there's a little bit of this seeping into the consciousness. Just one other point to bear in mind. Mm-hmm. There are 500 Israeli companies working in Arab states, Gulf states in particular. Now, they're not there as Israelis. They don't have Israeli passports, but there's 500 Israeli companies, which means there's no taboo on working with Israelis as long as they have another passport and the fiction is maintained about who they're dealing with. That too is a new normal. That too accelerates the process. That too gives you a potential for the future because it shows what's to be gained, and a stake is built in continuing to cooperate that way.
So, can you help us think through what our response should be to this? American Jewish organizations, how might we think about it?
Well, look, I mean, across the board in Israel, this will be welcome because the Golan Heights is a strategic plateau that is unmistakable in terms of its military value, number one. Number two, you look at Syria and nobody in their right mind would say Israel should be getting off the Golan Heights. So I think, I think it can be welcomed. I would couple it with a statement that says it is important to also, if over time we're going to reduce the prospects of conflicts, it's also important to find ways to address Arab concerns as well. I think you can say that. You don't have to say more. But yeah, look, my position is going to be as I've described it. I'm not just saying it to you. I'm saying it publicly too. Israeli control is essential. Israeli sovereignty, acknowledging Israeli sovereignty was not.
Great. Well, Ambassador Ross, it's almost Shabbat. We really appreciate you getting on so late in the day. We really appreciate our viewers coming on so late in the day. This has been very informative. I think it will really help us think through what we should say and do in the coming weeks. And we always appreciate your sage advice to us. Thank you so much, and Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thank you. Bye-bye.